An investigation by the New York Times reveals that Boeing pressured the Dutch safety board into downplaying its role in a deadly 2009 737 crash. Allegedly, Boeing forced the final report to either exclude or minimize criticisms of the manufacturer, instead shifting the blame entirely onto the now deceased pilots of Turkish Airlines Flight 1951. On the 25th of February 2009, a Boeing 737-800 departed Istanbul Airport in Turkey bound for a foggy Amsterdam. Instructor Captain Hassan Arizin sat in the left seat and was training Murat Caesar, who sat in the right seat flying as co-pilot. There was also a safety pilot on board sitting in the center jump seat to provide additional support. The majority of the flight was uneventful for the 128 passengers and 7 crew members. 2 hours into the flight, cruising at 8,000 feet, the plane began its descent into Amsterdam airspace, approaching the airport from the east. Suddenly, the captain's radio altimeter flashed an alarming reading of -8 feet. The aircraft was nowhere near the ground, yet this critical instrument now indicated it was below sea level. To understand why this will become a problem, you must understand what the radio altimeter is primarily used for. To perform auto landings on the 737, 3 requirements must be met. 1. There is no target altitude selected on the autopilot's panel. This is so that the autopilot understands that the pilots are aiming to land instead of climb. 2. The flaps must be set at an angle greater than 12.5 degrees. Flaps at this angle can only be set when the aircraft is close to landing. And finally 3. The autopilot must detect an altitude below 27 feet, and the system used to measure this altitude is the radio altimeter. Once all 3 requirements are met, the autothrust then rolls back the engines to idle thrust, known as retard, and pitches the nose of the aircraft up in an attempt to slowly touch down on the runway. However, there are 2 radio altimeters on board, one for each pilot. The left-hand altimeter is the default for various systems including the autothrottle, and if it fails, the plane should switch to the right-hand one. In this case, the first officer's radio altimeter indicated the correct height, while the captain's altimeter incorrectly showed -8 feet. The incorrect reading from the captain's altimeter wasn't registered as an error, and so the plane didn't switch to the first officer's altimeter. As a result, the autothrottle used the captain's faulty altimeter. Note that there are 2 autopilot systems, Command A for the captain and Command B for the first officer, each using their own radio altimeters. Since the first officer was the pilot flying, he used Command B, which relied on the correct reading from his right-hand altimeter. This caused the autothrottle and the autopilot to be reading 2 different altitudes, as the autothrottle was reading from the left-hand altimeter, which was wrong, and the autopilot was reading from the right-hand altimeter, which was correct. The crew were unaware of this, and they had no way of knowing about it. The Boeing manuals did not contain any procedures for errors in the radio altimeter system. In addition, the training that the pilots had undergone did not include any details that would have allowed them to understand the significance of the problem. As the flights continued their descent, the landing gear warning horn sounded to indicate that the aircraft's landing gear should be down, as the aircraft was, according to the captain's radio altimeter, flying too low. The crew correctly identified the source of the problem and continued their descent. Due to Amsterdam International being a busy airport, planes are often given a short approach. This same approach was given to this flight. This means that they will intercept the localizer 5 nautical miles away from the runway, much closer than the standard 8 nautical miles. Therefore, the plane will be above the glide slope capture and will have to descend quickly to intercept it. To intercept the glide slope, the co-pilot selected the vertical speed mode to descend at 1400 feet per minute. This switched the autopilot out of trying to maintain a target altitude. with the flaps near a landing angle, no target altitude selected, and an altitude apparently being below 27 feet. The autothrottle thought they were about to touch down on the runway, and so entered the retard flare mode and rolled back the thrust to idle. However, the flight crew expected this to happen, as they wanted to descend, and to do this they expected the autothrottle to roll back. The faulty operation of the autothrottle was being masked by the descent to intercept the glide slope. The retard flare mode is indicated on the primary flight display, and if the pilots were paying attention they would have noticed this. The plane intercepted the glide slope, and then immediately began falling below the glide path as there was insufficient thrust to maintain the slow descent. And so, the autopilot began pitching the nose of the aircraft up to reduce their descent. Usually, the autopilot's pitching up would be accompanied by the autothrust increasing the throttle. However, because the autothrust thought that they were about to land, this didn't happen. This led to the plane bleeding off more speed. As airspeed reached 126 knots, the airspeed indicator started to flash, trying to get the pilot's attention. The artificial horizon also showed that the nose attitude of the aircraft was becoming far too high. The crew did not respond to either of these warnings. At an altitude of 406 feet, the stick shaker went off to warn the pilots that the plane was approaching stall speeds. The plane was travelling so slow that the wings of the aircraft are not providing sufficient lift, and soon they would fall out of the sky. Finally, the crew responded, but they did so inadequately. Once the stick shaker activated, the co-pilot pushed the throttles forwards and pitched the nose of the aircraft down. However, he failed to turn off the autothrottle, and so the thrust levers immediately went back to idle. Once the captain took control, both autopilot and autothrust were deactivated, and then he pushed the throttles forwards and pitched the nose down. However, it was too late, and the plane crashed into a field tail first and split into 3 pieces. All 3 pilots were killed in the crash, along with 1 cabin crew member and 5 passengers. 128 injuries occurred, 11 of them serious. The surviving passengers exited the aircraft and waited for help. The Dutch Safety Board took 1 year to release a final report and suggested that Boeing had been made aware of the consequences of a faulty radio altimeter, with 5 incidences occurring and being reported to Boeing since 2004. In all 5 incidences, the autothrottle entered the retard flare mode, and the flight crew noticed immediately and disengaged the autothrottle. Boeing released a software fix in 2006 to prevent this issue, but it only applied to 737s built after 2006. The 737 involved in this crash was built in 2002 and fatally crashed in 2009 to an issue that was fixed 3 years ago. In January 2022, in the aftermath of the Boeing 737 MAX groundings, the New York Times claims that the Dutch Safety Board's final report either excluded or downplayed criticisms of the manufacturer after pushback from a team of Americans that included Boeing and federal safety officials. This team of Americans said that certain pilot errors had not been properly emphasized, meaning that Boeing thought that more blame ought to be put onto the pilots in the final report, and it seems that they got their way. In February 2022, it was reported that Boeing had refused to cooperate with a new review into the crash investigation, and that the National Transportation Safety Board, a US government agency, had also refused a request from Dutch lawmakers to participate.